say welcome, so there's going to be a lot of repeating. But it is also really to settle in for this session. And I'm happy that we can start when all the four speakers have arrived. I put them safely in the front, so I can keep them close. And this morning, each of these four panel speakers will give a short presentation, half an hour, to explain the position. And in the afternoon, we will have a debate. There will be a slight change because due to circumstances, Françoise Kom it's not possible that she is here in the afternoon. So if you have questions for Françoise, we'll have to do that right away. I just make the welcome a little bit shorter, and we give some extra time to Françoise, so you can ask her questions and discuss things if need be. Well, now, my task is to introduce people, but I always find it very, very difficult. I look at people giving introductions for panels, and then they take a piece of paper and they start looking. This person is graduated. Yes, of course, otherwise he would not be here. So, my solution to this problem is quite simple and straightforward. I ask people to introduce themselves. Karia, would you like to start? Telling the people who you are and what brings you here, what you are going to talk about. And maybe you can just stand up and turn around, because now with your back to the audience, which is...
Hello, my name is Karia. I'm from University Technology Malaysia. I'm actually heading the Center of Engineering Education in Malaysia, in the university. I've been involved in PBL for quite a long time, since the early 2000s. And championing the cause. Seems like a lost cause at that time. But things have grown beyond my expectation, and with the full community support, we have managed to grow it into something at a national level, and we are also doing something at the Asian level now. So I'll share my experience later on during my talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Sophie, would you like to continue? Yeah, we could do ladies first, but we can also just follow the line.
I feel underrepresented in this panel. I'm Xavier Fouget. I'm with Dassault Systèmes, which is a company. I will spend 30 seconds telling you about that. My role is to connect this company with the academic world worldwide. And what brings me here is, I don't know exactly, but it's about 10 years of working together with CEFI and with Eric and with Annette, because in CEFI everyone knows Annette as a former president of CEFI, and I'm a vice president of CEFI.
So I'm Françoise Kom. I'm the General Secretary of CEFI. For quite a long time, I have to admit now. I'm involved, I'm not an engineer myself, so please don't ask me technical things. I'm involved in engineering education, and so I've also been involved in, as director of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations for 2 years in Paris UNESCO. So we just maybe a little bit from CEFI 10 years ago. And I'm a philologist and a sociologist by education. And I won't say too much because, I will give you a very detailed presentation about CEFI and its activities, the network, history, etc. You already know about our connection with University of Aalborg, thanks to the persons. Annette, Eric also has been our vice president. Eskil is now director of CEFI, so meaning that we have special connections with these universities.
So I'm Denise Savant. I'm a PhD researcher at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam, and I guess by trade I'm an education philosopher. My area of expertise is the history and the philosophy of problem-based learning and education more generally, and so I'll be talking to you about just that.
And Ginny talked about this topic of her research last year at the IRSPBL conference in Malaysia, hosted by Korea. And we thought her story was so much interesting for people who are interested in problem-based learning to look back at the roots, that we thought we must ask her again also to come here. So yeah, there's many explanations for how we put people together in a panel. Xavier complains that he's a minority. That's only how you look at it. If you would look at what language people speak naturally from starting, there are 3 French-speaking people in this country. So that's a majority. It's Korea who is the minority. You see, there's many ways to look at this and to define it. But we would like to represent different looks at problem-based learning, different ways of how people work with problem-based learning and what interests them, and how we can work together towards a developing position for the future of problem-based learning. So that's what the objective of this whole session will be about. There's one thing Ida asked me to mention. If you look at the site, Ida has a camera over there. Hi, camera. Hi, Ida. And she's making recordings for our website, UCPBL. It will not be full scale, but if someone picks his nose or something like that, then it definitely will be cut out and published. If you don't want it, then you're free to leave. Okay, I think, yeah, about half the time I managed to cut short on the welcome and introductions. You see, they all graduated, they all mentioned that about themselves. And I would like to just make a start with the presentations. And if we have some extra time saved in this quick introduction, we can use it for extra questions for Françoise. Françoise, please come forward. Or this one? This one needs to be pointed at that.
So, sorry, and I'm one of those, I didn't stay for long, I grew up in theater. So, well, first of all, welcome everybody. So you already know who I am. Thank you to Eric and to the organizers for the invitation and for giving me the opportunity of presenting the CEFI. I know that, well, several colleagues in the room know probably as much as I know about the society, even maybe more in certain cases, isn't it, Eric? But still, I mean, I hope I can be informative at least for the majority of persons here in the room. So, what's CEFI? You may ask, for speaking about European Society for Engineering Education, we call it CEFI, which is actually the French acronym of the Société Européenne pour l'Information des Ingénieurs, knowing that CEFI has been created over 40 years ago in a period of time when French was still kind of international language, and being also based and founded in Belgium, French was the official language of the society at the time of its creation. But we have 3 official languages, the French, English, and German. We commonly say that CEFI is the largest network of higher engineering education institutions and educators in Europe, and I believe this is true. We've been founded, as I told you, in 1973 by 21 universities, faculty of engineering, mainly the deans and directors of the university at that time. Again, think about the 70s, construction of Europe, the Europe of education, so it was well before all these huge European Union programs you all know probably from Europe and from abroad, meaning that already at that time it was a willingness at the level of those persons, our founders, to develop activities, to better know what was going on in the different countries, in Europe in the field of engineering education, and to already start some actions in the field of mobility, of teachers, researchers, students, etc. We are based in Brussels, we're a non-profit organization, meaning small by size, but large by willingness and objectives. And if by chance you're in Brussels, you're pleased to come to visit us. We're very close to the European Union area. So I would say that we're in the core of the discussion at the European level. Even if I want to say, you will see that later when I speak about the membership, we're not an EU organization. We are European organizations with members until Russia. We have members from Tomsk, and I mean also going to Istanbul and Ankara and other parts of Europe. Our mission, well, to summarize, the mission is to support, promote, improve European higher engineering education. And by doing this, also to contribute to the improvement of the image of engineering education and of the engineers in society. So that's the mission. We have these objectives, and what we do, we formulate positions and ideas on engineering education issues. We hope that we succeed, at least that's something we are aiming to ensure a certain influence on the engineering education programs in Europe. We work to develop and improve the communication between the different stakeholders, as I said earlier, meaning that we bring together people, the students, the teachers, the academic community, the institution as such, being the research-oriented institutions, the practice-oriented institutions, many related organizations, European international bodies, UNESCO, enterprises. And so we act as a link between all those persons or members, other organizations in Europe and in the world. Of course, I mean, by doing this, we hope to recruit also good, to contribute to the recruitment of good students in engineering education. You know that this is a main issue in Europe, it's the recruitment of students in engineering. And it was always also one of our objectives to encourage and promote the development of what we call before European, but I guess nowadays it's international dimension in the engineering education. We do that according specific values that have been decided by the board of directors and approved by your members that are, I won't go too much in detail, but the creativity and professionalism, engagement and responsibility, that seems obvious in achieving objectives and aims and fulfilling our mission for the benefit of engineering education. The respect of diversity and different culture, this is very important. Working with different regions all over the world, with specific social, economic settings, different educational environment, different cultures, different way of thinking, communicating, including different languages. The institutional inclusiveness, you've seen that we talk, I mean, with institutions differently orientated, and this is important for us. So we want to involve all these stakeholders all together. They are all important in the discussion. And the multidisciplinary and openness is also one of the our values, of course, being transparent and a sustainable organization. I won't show you anything concerning our structure because I think the structure of an organization like CEFI is pretty common for a non-profit organization of that kind. But the organization is directed by a board of directors, I mean, fixing the strategy and the policy of the organization, assisted by a steering committee and general assembly of the members. And we have a head office based in Brussels. There are 2 persons to coordinate the network in these 48 countries. Actually, to summarize, I would say that CEFI is today more than 41 years actually now, with more than 40 years of dedication and services to higher education. It's also 40 years of patience, and I think the word is, it's strong, but I think it's a real patience that animates, I mean, all those involved in the CEFI network. And I know everybody speaks about patience, but believe me, this is really true. And of course, it's the networking from 21 founding members, I would say, rectors, club of rectors. Now we have 415, including close to 200, it's a little bit more than the figure of 180, but close to 200 universities, faculty of engineering in 48 countries. Because of its structure, because of its mission, I think we can say that CEFI is nothing but its members and the contributions from its members. I spoke about the inclusiveness aspect of the organization, and I have to say that I think this is really a specificity of the organization. It's a diversity of the members. I mentioned the institutions, giving of course a complete curriculum, leading to an academic engineering degree, the individuals, the corporates, associations, the related members that are, for instance, professional societies, like FEANI, for instance, and others we have a deep connection with, other organizations, institutions that fulfill the criteria to become institutional members, but also student organizations. And actually, I'm really happy to see that the student organization of this university is a pretty active member of CEFI. So this is a picture of CEFI in Europe only in 2014. So you see that we have members in many other countries, so the list is not exhaustive. But we also have a part of the other structure aspect, boards, etc. We also have a network of national correspondents, and the two national correspondents for these countries are actually two persons we know very well, actually, as they are former president of CEFI, Annette Kolmos, former vice president Dr. Eric de Graaf, and meaning that we have the pleasure and the opportunity to cooperate pretty often together. So that's the structure, the mission, the objective. So you know now why CEFI has been created, what we try to do, but how do we do it? To do it, we have different tools, if I may say so, at our disposal. And for instance, and most probably one of the most important ones is other working groups. We have so far 11 working groups in CEFI dealing with specific themes of engineering education. Sometimes they are very specific, like mathematics and physics in the context of engineering education. Sometimes they are a little bit more general. Sometimes they also have all these social aspects, like the attractiveness of engineering education, the sustainability, the ethic questions, the new educational technologies, ICTs, etc. But I have to say that to come back to the topic of this symposium, it's essentially groups like the Curriculum Development One, the Engineering Education Research, that are those that have organized very frequently actually workshops on topics like problem solving, active learning, changing engineering paradigm, etc. Yeah, we say that the working groups are the backbone of the society, and I think that I can speak on behalf of our members. I think it's true. I mean, because without the working groups, they are in charge of the contents, of the discussions, and that's very important for us. So we also have special committees. We have on global partnership, that's mainly the cooperation with the rest of Europe and the rest of the world organization. We have a university business group that is chaired by our Vice President Xavier Fouget. We have cooperation with the students, more internal committee, and then we have, and it was just created actually last week in Birmingham, a task force on engineering skills. And actually this task force is a result from the inaugural CEFI debate we have in Brussels in early April, and that highlight the pressing need for deep understanding of the challenges facing engineering education in Europe. In the context of engineering skills, we realized from the discussions from academia, I will speak about this debate a little bit later, but that the perception, the understanding of engineering skills was not the same in all the countries. And therefore we thought that through the CEFI network, we could contribute in order to elaborate the reflection on this topic. Then we have also the annual conferences. And the annual conferences of CEFI are for sure one of the most important events of the year for our organization. Not just because it brings together most of our members once a year, but also because it's an opportunity to welcome colleagues, visitors who are not members of the society, who come from everywhere in the world. And so you can see, we will organize this year actually our 47th annual conference. So we're just going to the last year or last decade, if I may say so, we started in 2001, the conference organized in Copenhagen. You can see that we have had several conferences with topics that were not far from also the topic of this symposium. And I have to say that, of course, in all these conferences, even if the GI team was a little bit different, the conferences are preceded by workshops on specific topics, and it's common to have workshops on program-based learning, project-based learning prior to the CEFI annual conference. This year we will be in Birmingham in September 15 to the 19th on the theme of the engineering education for global competitiveness. Please mark the date in your agenda. I think it might be a very interesting conference. We expect around 300-350 participants. So far, the review process is not totally finished, but we have already accepted 156 papers from 29 countries. And you can see with some of them on topics like research methods, curriculum development, or active learning. And the conference will be preceded on the 15th by a workshop on engineering education and research. So that's the information about the conference, and you have leaflets over there if you're interested. You can go to the website of the conference, the website of CEFI. You will find plenty of additional information, also including the program and details about the keynote speakers, even if I believe that at least there are 2 of these keynote speakers who might be well known from this community, notably Sirama Krishna from National University of Singapore, and also Cynthia Altman from University of Washington. We have the working groups, the committees, the conferences. We have publications. We have regular publications like newsletter, etc., which is obvious for an organization of all kind, annual report, that's banal to say. We have specific publications, like the one, for instance, on the knowledge triangle you have over there, how to reinvent the future. We also have publications published by the working groups, for instance, the continuing education on innovation, quality in engineering education, or a very recent one, which is the 3rd edition of the core mathematics, the core curricula in mathematics, that was produced by a working group on mathematics. And then we published positions paper on Bologna. You know, Bologna process in Europe is a key element of the discussions, and also on things like hybridization and others. But one of the publications I can't miss in this presentation is our journal, the European Journal for Engineering Education, for several reasons, because I think it's really, a major scientific publication in the field. It exists now for almost 30 years. I thought that we have to think about the celebration soon, probably, because the chief editor is Eric Graf since 2006. That is a 1 bi-monthly journal. We also have some copies, but I can see that many have disappeared, but there are still 2 left. Otherwise, you can contact me and I can send you some copies if you're interested. It's published by Taylor and Francis in London, and there are also some online access that are possible. We have an editorial board composed of 39 members, amongst them 9 non-European. Amongst the popular topics of the journal, I think the list is very long of all the topics that have been, published or discussed at the level of the journal. I don't know how many papers, maybe Eric knows it, but thousands of papers published since its creation. But I can say that most of popular topics are frequently PBL and project-based learning, assessment of learning outcome, new technologies, engineering education research, innovation in engineering, etc. CEFI is also an organization of cooperation, and again, I know that seems a little bit obvious to say, because this kind of network, we are there to cooperate and influence. So we cooperate at the European level, we cooperate at the global level. At the level of the European, we cooperate with the Council of Europe, we have official relations with Council of Europe, and we maintain close relations with the European Union, especially the European Commission's directions taking care of higher education, obviously research, also social affairs, digital agenda, and employment, enterprise and employment. CEFI is also founding members of different kinds of organizations in Europe that complement a little bit the work of our network. In a not too ancient past, I would say we created in the 2006 INAE, the European Network for the Accreditation of Engineering Education, which is actually the sole example of an accreditation organization in engineering in Europe. And we are deeply involved in that organization. And we also created 2 years ago, after one discussion, lots of studies in the context of large European projects, but we created the European Engineering Deans Council, which is called EEDC. And but that will become a kind of a council under the umbrella of CEFI. But the council remains such. And we have permanent contact with a long list of organizations, like FEAN in Clio that are professionals, the FND more focusing on business management, AUA, you may know, it's the Youth University Association in Europe, and more regional one like the CEDEFI, bringing together the French deans in engineering, the Russian Association, sister organizations like CISAR, SOE, and others. And we are deeply involved in projects. Also, I think we started a European cooperation project in the early 90s. And so the list will be too long. So this year, our project is QUICA. This is a project aiming to enforce the quality assessment of engineering education in Central Asia. And we submitted last April 3 applications in the context of the new Erasmus+. Erasmus+ is that new, huge educational scheme that invented by the European Commission that bring together, just to summarize briefly, I mean, for persons out of Europe who are not deeply involved and concerned by this, but bringing together all the former programs, being Erasmus, Tempus, Comenius, all the others, in a one, and why Erasmus+? Because it's not just European, but the program is open also to colleagues from the rest of the world. We submit Knowledge Alliance project, strategic partnership, to summarize very briefly the all concerned university, business, regional authorities cooperation project, attractiveness, curriculum development. If you want more information about this project, because you might be interested to follow the work in this project, in the case they will be accepted, you can have a look at our newsletter that's available on the homepage of CEFI, and the last one, traditionally may, contains a presentation of this project. That was the European cooperation. We also deeply involved in the international cooperation. I should say, in a way, maybe more and more. And just to focus on the recent things, I mean, CEFI is a founding member of IFES, the International Federation for Engineering Education Societies, which for us, I mean, is an opportunity to meet partners from organizations similar to CEFI from all the rest of the world. And that, of course, is very rich for us, and it brings a lot of experience and examples, good practice that we can communicate to our members. And in that context, the 3 years ago, CEFI and IFES, and especially represented by the respective president of that time, Annette Cohn was for CEFI and Louis Morel for IFES, we decided to set up an international institute for developing engineering academics. It's called IDEA. We manage it from Brussels, CEFI, and from IFES Milwaukee. And the two co-directors for the present time are Eric de Graaf for CEFI and Jennifer Lebeau from MIT for IFES. We have official relations with UNESCO. We cooperate with UNESCO for quite a long time. We had even projects in the past financed by UNESCO, but that was a long past, I have to admit. We have contacts with OECD, ILO, we were in the preparatory group, and with many organizations like that list. I mean, I won't read it. It's longer, and you can see the dots. I mean, please go and visit the CEFI website. We have a page that's called the International Engineering Education Scene, and then you have a list and a connection to all the organizations we are cooperating with. I won't say on a daily basis, but on a weekly basis at least. Maybe just to emphasize here, I mean, because the first one is an event to be organized in June 2014. This is the American Society for Engineering Education Conference, and in this context, CEFI this year is in charge of the plenary session of the International Forum that is the body traditionally organized in the context of its annual conference. So we'll be represented there by one of our board members in charge of the Dean's Council, Professor Murphy from the IIT Dublin, and by the CEFI President, Professor Kamal Awash from the University of Birmingham. Then, speaking about the Deans, I also would like to mention here the strong cooperation we have now with the Global Engineering Deans Council, chaired by John Beenan from Adelaide University, Hans Hoyer from GEDC IFES, and we are now preparing a joint workshop together for the Deans in cooperation with the Italian Deans, and that would be organized on the occasion of the WEAVE. I don't know if WEAVE is something familiar. Sorry, I know there are many, many acronyms, but it's no way to avoid the acronyms, I'm afraid, these days. And WEAVE is for the World Engineering Education Forum, and traditionally brings together several major international conferences in engineering education on that period. So, closing to the end of the presentation, I would like to emphasize also some specific activities organized by CEFI on top of the regular one. And even if the first one becomes regular now, it's the European Conventions for Deans in Engineering. We started that process in 2005, and considering the success of the event, I have to say, it started now become a kind of annual event. And we even have the tradition of organizing it not just alone, but in cooperation with our sister organization, CESAR. The last one was organized just 6 weeks ago in Lund on educating engineers for a connected world. And it was a very successful event, and the next one will be organized in March next year, University of Italia di Valencia. Apart from this convention for deans, and on the initiative of our new president, Professor Awash, we also started the CEFI debates. I mentioned when I spoke about the task force on skills earlier, the first inaugural debate we had in Brussels that was organized also in April. You can see that April was a very dense month as far as our activities are concerned. And it was a debate organized on the theme of engineering education facing the challenges of the crisis in Europe. If I tell you that it was organized also with very strong support and involvement of our Vice President, you can see on the right Professor Antonia Moropoulos, Vice Rector from the National Technical University of Athens in Greece. You may guess why the topics of the crisis have been chosen. And also it was organized with the support of the Hellenic presidency of the European Union and organized their permanent representation. I have to say that has been a very successful debate. The objective for the debates, I mean the CEFI debates, especially is bringing together regularly colleague stakeholders, not especially members of CEFI. It's not really addressing CEFI members. It's addressing stakeholders. It's organized in Brussels. Normally it's morning or end of afternoon. People take a drink. We have 1 or 2 speakers, introducing the discussion with provocative point of view, etc., and then we exchange with the audience. So it's real debate, nothing to do with a conference or workshop, something. Well, I had here, but I'm afraid I see the time, of course, going on. So just for you to know, if you're interested to know about what would have been said during this kind of debate, you have on the website of CEFI, you have the record of the presentation made by the Commissioner for Education, Vassiliou, who's in the center of the picture between our President and Vice President. And you also will have a communiqué de presse, a press review that will, press review? Press release, thank you very much. A press release that will be published by the end of this week, and containing some major ideas that have been expressed on the occasion of that debate. CEFI Awards, I don't go through it. Just to mention that since 2 years now, CEFI will give a prize for the best PhD thesis in engineering education, and will give for the first time this year a Skin Award for students and students' organization active in engineering education. So, looking towards the future, and that's maybe a little bit more complicated in a way, because now we've done a lot, and the problem for an organization like CEFI is not just continuing and doing the same all the time. It's just to extend, to develop, and to profile, for the next 40 years, if I may say so. So we our board just approved a new orientation paper for the next 5 years, And amongst the topics, for the next 5 years, you have the following topics. The question of the attractiveness seems obvious according to the general situation in Europe. Education and skills and employability, ensuring the best preparation of graduates for European and worldwide employers. And the capacity building, the mobility of graduates, that's all the question of the accreditation and quality assurance in Europe and in the world. The new technological context, there's no way to avoid it, I'm afraid. We even may have to discuss things like the MOOCs and the e-learning, open and online, the cybersecurity, data protection. So there are a long list of topics that will be on the agenda of these discussions groups in the context of that team, and of course the engineering education research, because we consider, of course, this is the raison d'être of CEFI. So as conclusion, what I hope, I was able to give you and to communicate to you and to share with you is the fact that CEFI is actually a community of practice, of engineering educators, the people interested and passionate by engineering educations, or the partners. The European dimension also, meaning that the issue tackled by our members, okay, while possibly global, they originate from challenges faced by European engineering education and institutions. We try and we hope we have a certain influence on engineering education in Europe. The diversity of the stakeholders, I said at several occasions, it's voluntary. People are willing, nobody is obliged to be in CEFI. They all are willing to be there and to work together. The European and international cooperation, the projects that are very important as far as we're concerned. Then Conference 2014, I repeat, mark your diaries. 2015, in the case you can come to Birmingham and you are curious to know a little bit more about CEFI from the ground, I would say, not just from a presentation like this. It's a conference we will have in Orléans, very near to Paris, in June 2015, followed 2016 by a conference to be organized in the University of Tampere in Finland. I can only say that questions like the PBL, problem-based learning, they are on agenda, they've been on the agendas for years, they are on the agenda, they will be on the agenda, they will be discussed through all these tools we have at our disposal, all these committee groups, conferences, articles, paper, and I hope that will continue. So thank you very much. Visitors, we are in that strange area now.
This is your view. This is your present view.
More or less.
Thank you very much, Françoise, for giving us such a comprehensive overview of what CEFI is doing, has been doing in the past years, and will do in the future for engineering education. I think we need to see this in a context where engineering education in the past 100 years has gone very slowly, maybe unnoticeable slowly, through a very major change. I would say over 100 years ago, just before the First World War started, engineers were trained for a lifetime. You went to your polytechnic, you got your degree, and then you had a career. And if you look at education for engineers, it was a very solitary business. It was the professor who built his own ideas of his curriculum, how he would teach. He may consult some of his colleagues sometimes, but basically the professor makes decisions completely on his own. And gradually, we have seen that education has become teamwork, that you cannot teach on your own anymore. That is true for problem-based learning, but I would say it is true for all the education we're making. Also with the new technologies. You do not have an expert anymore who can oversee everything. Experts will have to work together and to share their knowledge and capacity. And in that sense, an organization like CEFI has become more and more important because it provides for people the opportunity to make the contacts they need in their profession to do their jobs. So I think when you come to the last slides, when you show what CEFI actually has been doing in the past years and will do in the near future, then you can see how important it is for everyone who is involved in engineering education to participate in an organization like this. And I think with your immense experience in CEFI, I think you were a bit modest. Françoise has been at the core of CEFI for over 25
No,
years.
but don't insist too much. I mean,
So to a large extent, yeah, you know, these presidents, they are empowered for 2 years. And in the first year they have big plans, and in the second year they are preparing for their goodbye. So
they're facing the
in between it is Françoise who makes everything smooth and makes things happen.
trying to.
As far as it's successful, it is yours. Otherwise it's the president's.
Yes. And if not, in any case, if questions came later, I mean, into your mind, you know how to reach me. I'm an over-connected person. We are on Facebook.
Oh, and there are questions. You know.
Everything.
Yes?
Yeah, thank you. My name is Katrina Diamet. I'm from Tanzania. I'm the chair of the board of Africa Leads, president. Yeah, your last comment that PBL was in the agenda for quite some time, I think. And it is still, what does that really mean? Have some of the universities, have they adopted, what are the issues?
Well,
And I also want to generally ask you one of the major changes that CEFI was able to influence in terms of engineering teaching.
okay. Speaking about the influence, I have to say that you have to see that in the context of the last 40 years. As I mentioned, we have in Europe now tools existing, I mean, in order to promote, encourage the international cooperation, the exchange of students and teachers, etc. But many of these ideas actually, and I can say it, I wasn't there, not me, the predecessor, so I can say it very quietly and with a very clear mind. I can say that really I believe that in the field of engineering education, CEFI as the first organization was one who contributed to the idea. For instance, 15 years before the existing of this international education program in Europe, I mean, CEFI already had a program that was called ETAC, the European program for in order to enable students to make their thesis abroad. But that was organized, we encouraged double diplomas. I mean, we organized through the conference, etc., all this permanent exchange of colleagues that aimed, I mean, to produce some policies. For instance, we're involved in the Bologna process. We give opinions about the Bologna process in the context of engineering. You may know that Bologna process for engineers and for medical doctors is a little bit special. It's not that easy to be implemented as such. So we contribute to this. How do we do that? Of course, we are not imposing anything to members. So that's what I say all the time. We hope we succeed to influence. We can make suggestions, we can make recommendations. We do that via the position paper, the publication, the work achieved by your working groups, for instance. And then there are some recommendations. CEFI is an organization of exchange of good practice. So that's why the conferences are important, because when you come, you can meet your colleagues who are successful in something you would like to implement in your university or your region, your country, etc. You can get some inspiration. And that works pretty well, I have to say, this exchange of good practice. The first question was
PBL.
the PBL. Well, PBL, I mean, CEFI, PBL in CEFI, it's PBL persons in CEFI. I mentioned Eric, Annette, many others. I mean, essentially, Aalborg University. I think that.
May I add to that point?
Yes, of
Because
course.
it's
You, it's better, please.
I came first to CEFI in 1993, and I was invited to give a speech at a seminar organized by the working group Curriculum. That is one of the working groups of CEFI. And it turned out that the working group curriculum for a long time already highlighted the importance of project organized learning, problem-based learning, active learning. In one way or another, the working group curriculum worked towards promoting, you might say, problem-based learning in different places, in different stages. So for me, coming into CEFI was because of problem-based learning. It's been at the heart of the activities as long as I remember.
Well, I also remember very concrete activities, I mean, in the field. For instance, in order to promote the model, for instance, organized also that period of time, was end of the 90s, I mean, study visits that we had organized for colleagues, for instance, from Baltic States countries. Baltic States countries were not in the EU, of course, at that time. And it was a very high, or from colleagues from that was small schools in Petersburg, Electrotechnical University, and we organized study visits, and we came with them, I mean, to this university. So in order to show them, I mean, what it was, I mean, actually, with PBL. So it can be time to time, it's not just the work of the working groups that then can be communicated and spread, and then, of course, we can't measure the impact. Measuring the impact of our work is a little bit difficult for an organization like ours. Sometimes it's time by, you know, occasionally, I mean, you hear about the influence you have, but sometimes you can have a very direct one organizing this kind of actions. And study visits were really on the agenda of our work, I mean, for quite a time. Nowadays, it's a little bit more difficult because finances is an issue, I mean, for the study visits. For instance, I have to say, speaking of UNESCO, it happened that we had a series of study visits that were financed by UNESCO, and former UNESCO person in charge of engineering, Benjamin Tim, who was from Ghana, and in that context we had organized also several of these visits and projects, and also inviting colleagues from African organizations to come to Europe and to occasionally for some PBL, but not just PBL. As you've seen, we touch a lot of topics.
Okay, thanks. There was a next question, lady behind. Yes, maybe.
Yeah, no, it was actually very much in the same line.
Okay.
My name is Margaret Lam Andersen, and I happen to be working also with Africa Leaks. So my question was more on what plans you have in the future for extending to sort of the world, meaning, for instance, Africa. I mean, more particularly Africa,
Well,
and whether you have any sort of specific offers for that.
Yeah, I have to say this is for CEFI something we haven't been good enough so far. If I miss this, so it's a little bit roughly. For instance, we had started a working group on cooperation. I hate the name, I have to say, with developing countries. What does that mean? That's another question. But at that time, and that was after the Rotterdam conference, organized by Eric on the theme of engineering is fun, and we had a very strong delegation from African countries and colleagues, and Mona was here also, and it was, what do you say, that an élan, a move, I mean, to create something like this, because it's something we've been active in the 90s, and it was a little bit slow, and it was time to reactivate, I mean, the discussions. And you've seen we cooperate with this organization in Asia, mainly South America, US, CITRA, Russia. So, I mean, why not, I mean, also the African continent, and so that's important. So far we have discussions to reactivate. We need leaders. As I told you, CEFI Brussels, it's 2 persons. It's me and my young colleague, and we coordinate. Remember that I said this is a voluntary work organization, so all those interested, willing to participate, to make some suggestion of ideas, to initiate the process, because it's a question of beginning. I mean, if you initiate the process, I'm sure that other colleagues will join the team and cooperate and work with you. But we need strong personalities, so please take it into
also,
consideration
I
and
think
come back
it is
to me.
important for CEFI to work from a foundation, from a basis in Europe. And from Europe, we can participate in activities in other continents, in other parts of the world. But I think it is more natural for us to do such things, not just as CEFI, but in collaboration with others. I know that there is quite a lot of activities going on in Africa, which are supported by IFES. Françoise is our representative in IFES and the board. So it would be more natural for CEFI to participate in IFES or IDEA activities in Africa than to go out there ourselves on our own. But that is just...
Yes, that's right. I should have seen it. I also take a picture for my
Yeah.
Facebook and Twitter.
Okay, good. No, it's done, Françoise. I did it while
Why
you
you make a
were not.
selfie?
Listen, no selfie. No.
Yeah,
No, but the certain lady is not recommended. No. Let's get done.
Françoise, you are already online.
Am I?
Yes.
Oh, this is scary. Okay. Just another one to be sure.
Mona, you still had one short question?
Yeah, I also had a question. My name is Mona Lisa Dance, and funnily enough, my question was exactly along the same lines.
Right.
Because as you already
the point is an
mentioned,
important
we
point.
were trying to set up a working group
Yes.
under CEFI
Yeah.
concerned with engineering education in Africa. There is still in existence the African Engineering Education Association. I was invited to give a PBL workshop in the recent 5th regional conference in Lagos in September last year. And following on that conference, we decided to try to keep the momentum by setting up a regional workshop in East Africa and another regional workshop further towards West Africa. And so far we have actually come to an appalling stop. We were discussing even last night, and we decided that we have to postpone about a year or so, mainly because of lack of funding. We have the program, we have a number of people willing to go and even willing to pay for their own expenses if need be, but we are still lacking the sufficient funding to get going. So what I was wondering is, maybe we could revive some, you had on your slide international cooperation with joint projects or joint events, and I think Africa is one big hole, so to speak. So can we try to revive the African cooperation somehow? And I'll try to...
I would
Give me your
suggest you
business
continue
card.
this
Push
talk
it.
Give me your
I
business
can.
card. I want to keep, the opportunities of contacting you and maybe initiating something together.
Okay, I think we can maybe start some good cooperation here. Great. Okay, shall we thank Françoise for her contribution one more time? And we give the floor to the next speaker, Jimmy. You didn't check, so I hope these are the slides that we see the last ones you sent to me.
So I Alright, good morning. Here I am again. It's been a year since Malaysia. And for those of you who think that I'm going to talk exactly about the same thing as Malaysia, you're wrong, of course. I mentioned the P word, philosophy, and I see a lot of engineers in the room going, philosophy, oh my god. Well, I'm going to be here to argue today why it is so necessary for us to go back to the fundamentals of education and to start with philosophy no matter what discipline we're from. I'm not an engineer, I've never studied engineering. Actually, by training, I'm a political scientist who converted over to education philosophy. And I'm going to travel back in time to the origins of PBL, not only from its historical standpoint, but really from the essence of its philosophical origins. I'm in the final year of my PhD, which is supervised by Henk Schliet, which was one of the founders of PBL in the Netherlands. And I'm currently at the Erasmus University College in Rotterdam. So our journey begins in 1969, a time of great revolution and change in Europe. and in America. And in fact, it does start in America, in Canada to be more precise, in September 1969. A very small medical school, 20 students in the first year in fact, started off with this revolutionary program. They didn't even have a name for it. They didn't even call it problem-based learning at the time. They didn't come up with the word until 1974. But they were the first ones to have this idea of doing small group problem-based curricula instead of having lecture-based. And I can see Mona shaking her head because she's thinking, well, Bremen, Brasilia, yes, of course. But the reason why I decided to start with McMaster is because I'm looking at those that, let's say, survived through the years and that we can learn from today. So the next one that survived, and some might say just, is Roskilde University in 1972. And indeed, they were much more influenced by the things that were going on in Brazil and Germany, as I will explain later. And they were founded just outside of Copenhagen. And they were founded on a slightly different model. This was the first surviving project-based learning, problem-oriented curriculum. In '74, they were closely followed by this university, which I guess you could say was the third then major reformed university. And at the same time, Maastricht University started a curriculum that was a copy, at least initially, of the McMaster program from '69. They were followed shortly after by a program in Australia, in Newcastle, and then the first Asian program, which was actually in '79, which is quite early if you think about it, and this was in Malaysia. And these were all medical schools. Same in '79, it comes to the USA with the New Mexico program, which was a real community-oriented medical program that used PBL as a means to help the community, especially in New Mexico. They had an issue with Native Americans and people in rural communities not getting access to medical education, so they thought, well, maybe PBL can help us with this. And then you can see in '85, Harvard likes to claim that they invented PBL, but in fact they borrowed it wholesale from McMaster in '85, called it the New Pathway Curriculum, and then decided that it was the most wonderful thing they'd ever come up with. To give them credit, they did come up with a case method in the 1930s, which was a big influence for PBL. But they certainly did not come up with the curriculum as it was adopted in '85. And then Linköping University was actually in the mid-'80s, not in the '70s, and they were among this movement in Europe of reformed universities, especially in medical and health sciences. And then in the '90s, PBL explodes across the world. We have curricula in Tokyo, first curricula come to Indonesia, in Gadjah Mada University, and then University of Hong Kong, mostly in medical schools, but then it starts developing in engineering, it starts to develop in law, in economics and business, and today I would say that there are more than 500 universities that use some form of PBL in almost every discipline that you can imagine, and I myself use PBL in liberal arts, so it can really be used for almost anything. It doesn't have to be sciences. Where did it all start? Well, the class of '72 at McMaster University. They were the first ones to actually use the word problem-based learning in '74, so this is where the term comes from, PBL. And these young chaps and ladies were the first graduating class. As you can see, it was different time, different fashion, different hairstyles. And at the back, you can see the founding fathers, and if you look all the way up to the right, that's Howard Barrows, that most of you have probably heard about. And you're probably under the idea or impression that Howard Barrows was the founder of PBL at McMaster. This is an erroneous conception. These were the founding fathers at McMaster University. Now, the man in the middle was the founding dean, John Evans, and he was a very young dean. He was 35 years old when he became the dean of this new medical school, and he was chosen specifically because he had a vision of education as something different. And he was surrounded by a team of phenomenal people. His right-wing man, Bill Spalding, was the man who put together the program, the architect of this new way of learning. And Spalding was a man who had a particular thing for Comenius, had read Comenius, and would quote Comenius randomly in his meeting notes. But for the rest of them, they were not really philosophers. They all read Flexner, as I will explain, but they were more practical people with a real passion for education. And in particular, Jim Anderson here, who was really a man who believed in students' freedom to learn more than anything. He had a tragic life himself. His son died at a very young age, and he decided to dedicate his whole life to helping students getting a better education. And he did this. Some call him the founding father of PBL in the sense that he was the one who came up with the idea of the tutorial groups, the role of the tutor in the medical model of PBL. And a lot of the things that we take for granted today come from this man's vision of what education should be about. And you'll say, what were the founding principles of PBL at McMaster in the medical model? Well, actually it's funny because it started with a profound hatred of lectures. Lectures are boring. This is something that the dean and the founding dean said. They had basically spent their time in medical education hating every minute they spent in the lecture room, just wanting to be with patients. You know, that's why they wanted to be doctors in the first place. And so the dean said, well, why don't we turn this all around? Why don't we start with patients? So in the first year, start with patient problems, and then we'll just learn on the basis of these problems. And they didn't know what to call this new way of thinking at the time. But then it was actually Howard Barrows who in '74 said, I know, let's call this problem-based learning. And that's the name stuck all through the years. But that was the foundational idea of problem-based learning. Note that in this program, the problems were created by course coordinators and not by the students. And that is the fundamental difference between the McMaster model of PBL and the Aalborg-Roskilde model of PBL, which we get to next. Now, indeed, in Brasilia and in Bremen, there have been some revolutionary ideas going around about some kind of project-based education. Unfortunately, they were unable to survive the political troubles of the 60s and 70s, and were either shut down or forced to reform to more traditional university style, if that makes sense, to reform to tradition. But in '72, something amazing happened in Denmark. A group of young students from the student union, in collaboration with the Social Democrat Party of Denmark, managed to convince the Danish government to start a university on radically different basis than had been done before, and especially compared to the University of Copenhagen. And this university was in Roskilde, and it was based around the idea of, well, this should illustrate it better. These are all newspaper clippings from that I found in the archives of Roskilde. Okay, fair to say it was a Marxist university. And the rector, who was a social democrat, was kindly asked to depart after a couple of years of being the rector there. And he was replaced by a kind American who was actually, by the words from the founders of this university, a little bit of a puppet in the hands of more radical elements in the university. And this was so bad that around '76, the parliament vote was held to figure out whether they would keep this university open or close it because it was too radical. And the vote was won by one vote by a Conservative Party member who voted against his own party, while there were 20,000 students in the street protesting to keep this university open. Well, it survived. It's still here today. And it survived. It wasn't the only university that adopted this model. Here in Northern Jutland in '74, the model of Roskilde was adapted to fit the regional circumstances of Aalborg. It was slightly adapted in the sense that, for instance, basic education, which lasted 2 years in Roskilde, only lasted 1 year here. But the idea, the fundamental ideas and the philosophy remained the same in Aalborg. Major difference, Roskilde does not have an engineering program, whereas Aalborg does, which does make a major difference when it comes to portraying yourself as a community-oriented practical university or a Marxist think tank. So, what were the principles, the foundational principles? I have these principles from someone who was very active in the student union movement at the time, Henning Stenning Olsen. And he said there were 3 principles. And one of them was student autonomy, meaning that students had the right to determine what they would study, and how they would study it. And you have to bear in mind that in the beginnings in Roskilde, it was all about project work. There were none of these parallel courses. If there were courses, the teachers had to be invited in by the students in accordance with their projects. They even had houses where these students would gather and have their own rooms, and a theory room where they could invite professors in to help them with their projects. So this was more than just words, this was actually put into action. And the second idea was that it was problem-oriented, meaning that instead of dividing up the curriculum into disciplines, it would be divided into problems that were relevant not only to the students, but to society as a whole. And finally, this went hand in hand with interdisciplinarity, which means that there were 2 years of basic studies in which students didn't specialize at all. They would either pick humanities, social sciences, or sciences, and then do that for 2 years before going on to something else more specialized. And this was a foundational idea of these universities that was expressed as project work. So project work wasn't the idea in and of itself, it was just the expression, the method by which these three foundational ideas took place in these universities. Okay, back to mainland Europe, and we're in the Netherlands now, in '74, and this is actually one of the first tutorial groups of my PhD supervisor in the medical school in Maastricht. What happened in Maastricht was that there were some political troubles, as with many of these universities. The coal mines were closing, and so they needed something to keep the people of Limburg politically happy, and so they decided to open a new medical school. But there were already 7 medical schools in the Netherlands, and the other medical schools were like, why do we need another medical school? And they said, all right, let's do something different then. Where can we look? Oh, I know, there's this medical school in Canada, let's see what they're doing. Legend has it they chartered a plane and sent a whole delegation, including ministers, over to Canada to see what was happening, came back like they had seen the Messiah and decided that this was the thing for them. And here we go, Maastricht University, the first Dutch university to adopt problem-based learning, and certainly the first European university to adopt the medical model of PBL. And they did something slightly different though, slightly different to McMaster. The first thing is they invented something called the 7-step method, which is a more structured way of doing PBL. And why would they do that? Well, think about it. The McMaster students were all graduates. They already had a bachelor, meaning that they came in aged between 21 and 30. When you're 21 to 30, you can already pretty much direct your own learning. This was a bachelor program. You have kids from high school coming in here. And you tell them, all right, now it's time to take control of your own learning. Okay, how do I do that? And so they decided to set up the 7-step method to help the students structure their own learning, basically to learn how to manage their own learning process. And this is a method which we still very much use in the Netherlands, and I use it all the time with my first-year students when I do PBL with them. The second difference, and this in the word of my supervisor, was that this wasn't about problem solving. And he said, you know, problem solving, that's something you do when you are a doctor, when you are an engineer. When you're a student, you need to understand the fundamental processes. What is this disease? What is the fundamental process behind this particular mechanics? If you don't understand that, how can you solve? And the idea was that as long as you're a student, the problems should be triggers to access content, to access knowledge. Problem solving comes later. And that was another fundamental difference. For example, Howard Barrows was very much hung up on the idea of problem solving as a skill independent of knowledge. Okay, and now I get to the philosophical part, I promise. What's it all about? Some would say at the very start of it all is the Socratic method. For those who don't know the Socratic method, it was a way, as recounted by Plato, in which Socrates would teach, and he would do so by asking questions to the students to allow them to elaborate on what they didn't think they knew, but they already knew. Vygotsky would have called this his own proximal development, but they didn't have these fancy words in ancient Greece, so it was a method of teaching by questioning. Okay, but if we look at the actual McMaster program, I would say the major influence was a humanist one. And I would definitely call these 3 people humanists, although self-directionists, although it's more close to the vocabulary that Rogers uses, it's not a very elegant phrase. How many of you have heard of Flexner before? Alright, so Flexner was an educator in the early 20th century. He actually wrote about medical education, but he was at heart not a doctor, he was an educator. He was among the first to say, enough with lectures. Lectures don't work, lectures are boring, content is outdated too fast. And he was perceived as a kind of philosophical god amongst the medics at McMaster and the medics in general in America. But really, the most important influence, and you probably recognize this name, is John Dewey. John Dewey, possibly the greatest American education philosopher. And John Dewey was quintessentially about bringing experience, meaningful experience, back into education. He was opposed to the idea of a dualism between your everyday experience and your theoretical learning at school. The two had to be connected, otherwise they would have no meaning. Otherwise you'd be unable to remember or to make sense of anything that you learned at school. And then Carl Rogers. Carl Rogers was an American psychologist. He treated mentally ill patients, developed something called client-centered therapy, and then developed an interest in education. He actually used the methods that he had developed working with seriously clinically ill patients on students. And the fundamental idea was being congruent. Congruent means being yourself, being real. That if you are anything but real with your students and if they are anything but real with you, you will not be able to significantly learn. Unless what you learn is relevant to who you are as a person, to what you want to be, to what you aspire to, then you won't be able to learn it, no matter how many times it's crammed down your throat. And he actually wrote in '69 a book called Freedom to Learn, in which the idea of self-directed learning came to the surface. And he is really, if you trace it back, the person who came up with the idea of self-directed learning. And to mention self-directed learning without understanding the ideas of Carl Rogers is really missing the whole point of this humanist philosophy that is behind PBL. And I love this particular quote from Dewey because it really reveals the idea that for Dewey the point of education was setting the mind free, to let people be intellectually free. And to do that, guess what? With a question, with a problem. Now Dewey of course never mentioned problem-based learning, that was way after his time, but at the very heart of it, he already had this idea that somehow if you begin with a question, you can end with intellectual freedom. At the other side of the spectrum, the behaviorist. Now, how many of you are familiar with Skinner's work? For those who are not, Skinner had a particular affection for conditioning lab rats in a cage to behave in certain ways with rewards. And he was convinced that this was the way to educate students. Like lab rats, you gave them rewards. Students, of course, can't express opinions or ideas, and you can't possibly tell what they're thinking, so you have to assess them through behavior objectives, performance objectives, that are very precisely detailed in this book by one of his followers. This book was all the rage in the 60s in America, Preparing Learning Objectives, Preparing Instruction Objectives, and it is a testimony to the belief that students cannot master their own learning, that they have to be trained like monkeys or like dogs. Fortunately, I would like to say that behaviorists did not win out at McMaster or in PBL, but when I see some PBL programs these days, I can see that the debate is still raging between the behaviorists and the humanists. I think this says it all, really. Forms of behavior can be maintained in strength for long periods of time. Wow, I'm so inspired to be, to follow education now. Okay, and now we get to one of the more interesting bunch, the radicals. And these really had a major influence at Roskilde and Aalborg. And indeed, if you look at Brasilia, the project-based education that developed in the 60s in Brazil, you could say it starts with the philosophy of Paulo Freire, who wrote The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And this really was a radical Marxist, clearly Marxist vision of the reasons behind education, deconstructing the problems with education in terms of Marxist philosophy. And in Europe, meanwhile, in the Frankfurt School, there was Oskar Leit and Alexander Kluge, who wrote several books in which they tried to deconstruct workers' education and explain it in terms of exemplary learning, meaning learning that had a meaning in their everyday experience. They talked a lot about experience as something that had to be rooted in the working class's experience of everyday life. Of course, if you trace this back, these radicals, it all boils down to these two gentlemen. They managed the improbable marriage of Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. And really, if you look at it, they borrowed ideas from psychoanalysis and ideas from the bourgeois versus the proletarian conflict to create a theory that was really about what can we do to make education something other than a tool of the bourgeois capitalist system. And this quote needs a little explaining. It was about the idea that the specialized knowledge in universities could not reflect the experience of society as a whole. And that this didn't have to do with the fact that academic speech was particularly complicated or jargonistic, or that somehow the proletarian were not able to grasp these ideas, but just that the knowledge of universities and the knowledge of everyday life of the working people was on so diverse material foundations that they simply did not coincide. And thus universities were simply a tool of bourgeois capitalist thinking. Okay, and finally, the last bunch, they came a little later, although they were chronologically earlier, their work was discovered later. Now there's a very good reason why Vygotsky was discovered later. He died in 1934 of tuberculosis, and if he hadn't, he would probably have ended up in a Stalinist purge because they weren't overly fond of his work in Moscow in the 1930s. But Vygotsky was a phenomenal psychologist, and his work was only really rediscovered when Jean Piaget started publishing and actually wrote an annotation to Vygotsky's thought and language. And the fundamental ideas of Vygotsky and Piaget are as follows. This is Piaget as interpreted by the Danish-German Nielsen, that there are three processes of learning: accumulation, assimilation, accommodation. That the shallowest level is the first one. Accumulation is like when you memorize a phone number. It has no meaning to you. You can memorize it for maybe 5 minutes. Okay, if you're good, you'll use mnemonics, and then you'll remember a little story to remember the number, but then you've already moved into assimilation. Assimilation is taking knowledge and putting it into what you already know, what you're already comfortable with. But real learning happens with accommodation, which is when you take something that is so new to you, so strange that it cannot fit into what you already know, your current vision of the world. You must change your vision of the world to adapt to this new information that you have, and thus you expand your worldview. And this idea of expansion really fits with Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, which is the idea that with the help of somebody else, or nowadays a machine, you can move out from what you already know into the black zone, which is your zone of proximal development. And you can see that it keeps growing, because once you're in the black zone, that becomes a new white zone, and the black zone expands outwards. How do we get there? We get there through a process called scaffolding, which is when tutor helps you by asking questions, possibly in a Socratic method, or by giving you a worksheet, or a logbook, or 7 steps to work with. So that's the idea that you're not just thrown unguided into your learning, but that you build it up like a ladder. A scaffold is basically something that holds up a building, and that's the idea that you hold up your knowledge until it's strong enough to stand on its own. So where does that leave us? Well, briefly I will go over this because it seems quite overwhelming when you look at that. This is by the work of Knud Ehlers, who is one of Denmark's most senior education theorists. And you can see that we find the idea of Piaget, Freud, and Marx at the 3 corners of the learning dimensions. But all of these names just go to show that PBL and project-based learning and education theory has borrowed from a lot of philosophy, a huge amount of philosophy. And you can't really talk about PBL or project-oriented learning without talking about learning philosophy. So where does that leave us? Well, my supervisor and I came up with this idea of a direction spectrum, which is how directed is a program, how structured is a program, or how intellectually free is a program. And I would say that if you looked at the original Roskilde model, we were pretty much on the unguided side of learning. With the idea of inviting teachers in as and when, with the idea of coming up with your own questions, with the idea that you would go out into society, and that the teachers couldn't control really the outcome of the learning. Now the original McMaster model, they had a slight problem. They had to take the license exam from Medicine of Canada at the end, so they kind of, by the end, it was almost like a syncope, because at the end of 3 years of free learning, we've got an exam, quick, 5 weeks, cram all the revision in, let's get the exam done. And then in Maastricht, because it used the step-by-step method, because they developed something called a progress test, which was a series of multiple choice questions to assess your learning as you went, it became a lot more structured than the original McMaster model. Where are we today? Well, in Asia, I only know Asia, but I know this also happens in other continents, a lot of models developed called PBL hybrids, in which, in medicine at least, you would have a traditional medical curriculum with a few PBL thrown in here and there for good measure, usually for accreditation measure. And they tend to be more on the directed learning side of things. And I would say if we look at the founding universities, Aalborg, Roskilde, Maastricht, McMaster as they are today, we're a lot more in the center of the direction spectrum. So, what does this mean? Where am I going with this? Well, I would say it's beyond disciplines now. We cannot talk about PBL or education in terms of engineering, or in terms of medicine, or in terms of law, or even in terms of just philosophy or education. Because philosophy at the heart, if you deconstruct it, means the love of wisdom. And that's a concept that's hard to commodify, to quantify, to put in an EU proposal. But it's at the very heart of everything that we do here as educators. And so education philosophy transcends disciplines. And so unless we manage to talk to each other as educators rather than engineers and doctors and lawyers, how are we supposed to convince the rest of the world that what we do is meaningful, that what we do has roots in education theory, in centuries of education thought, that, you know, it's not just a marketing gimmick? And if we don't do that, if we decide to stick to our disciplines, then what is to stop us from becoming basically factories for mass production of mediocre students? Unless we return to philosophy, unless we really think about the meaning of the education we want to give our students, how can we stand up to the market forces that are dominating education worldwide? I don't think we can. And, you know, there was an interview that I ran for my PhD research with a guy called Charles Engel, who was one of the founders of the Newcastle program, and he had a discussion with Howard Barrows, and he said, the conclusion was, Howard and I sat there and thought, how long can problem-based learning exist? Well, the answer is, if all we do is try to accommodate government demands for more quantity, more production, if all we do is divide ourselves into disciplines and sub-disciplines, then I'm afraid the answer to Howard Barrows' question is not that long. However, if we re-engage in education dialogue across the world and across disciplines, then not only do I think PBL will survive, but it will thrive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. You convinced me. It is really clear for me that engineering education needs philosophy. We need it to understand what we are doing. Maybe a lot of us are doing the right things, but if we don't know what we are doing, if we cannot explain why we are doing it, then we don't know how to keep it going. And I have seen on a very practical level several instances of failure of introduction of problem-based learning because people did not understand the philosophical consequences of what they were doing. They were trying to implement problem-based learning for a very competitive profession where people need to compete with each other. Asking people to prepare for a competitive profession by asking them to share their ideas in open discussion and in groups, it doesn't work. So you really need to be aware of what kind of profession you're training for, what is the society surrounding you, and what are the implicit values in that society. Otherwise, you cannot apply the education as a technique. So, thanks for teaching us. And basically, the discussion will be in the afternoon. There is room for a short question for clarification, if that is what you're aiming for.
Well,
if it's discussion, you have to say it.
It was actually rather a comment, if I can be
I think comments needs to be part of the discussion. So then I'm asking you to save it for the afternoon. Otherwise, everyone will leave after the lunch. Now we have to stay to listen to them. And of course, we are free to talk to each other in the coffee break that we have now.